welcome to the next episode of Grace Grid, my video podcast. Again, I'm continuing my series in my book, basically explaining the basic concepts in the chapter headings. And so this week, I'm going to be getting started in chapter 6, which speaks about the call of God and the way that it works. Rather than jump into the actual content of the chapter to start off, I think I'm going to be doing two videos. This first one, I'm going to be diving a little bit into my personal story and how I came to think the way I do about some of these issues, because if you've read the book, you know this is a controversial topic, dealing with election, predestination, some of those really, difficult biblical words, and digging into what they mean as they're used in places like Romans 8, Romans 9, Ephesians 1, Ephesians 2, because oftentimes I find in many conversations I've had about these things, rather than debate the issues, rather than talk about the actual content of Scripture, people will often back up because of the scary concepts that are there, and they'll question whether or not we should use our minds so much in trying to interpret these things, because these issues take a lot of thinking, and sometimes it hurts a bit. When I finished up Elam, I was a Rob Bell fan. Okay, now that might surprise some of you, because if you've ever had a conversation with me, you know that I've pretty much made up my mind about him in recent days. Particularly, when his book Love Wins came out a few years ago. He's really, in many ways, in recent years, abandoned some very central Christian truths in regard to hell, the way Christians should think about sexual ethics, in particular homosexuality. That's more recent, but many of you have probably heard of the book Love Wins. He basically questions some very, very long-held understandings of what it means to believe in heaven and in hell. And he basically theorized that, it's possible that everyone's going to be saved in the end. And so I was a fan of him back in the day before he said these things. And that's kind of the state I was in when I finished up Elam. And I had seen some people criticize him, but, I figured, well, they have no vision, really, because he's doing so many new things, and they're just scared of it. That's obviously what's going on. But I hadn't really been taught to think properly about these things. And so, I finished up Elam, and I went off to Nyack. And I had learned a little bit about Reformed theology at Elam. Not too much, but a bit. And so I went to Nyack. I ran into a group of friends who were Reformed, who were Calvinists. Again, not every one of you might know what that term means. I'll get into it in the next podcast. And so we would debate those issues. We would debate about predestination. We would debate about election. And in the end, I would stop and say, look, I'm sure, there's these two dividing sides on this. I'm sure that the truth is somewhere in the middle. That was always my way of solving the argument. I'd say it's somewhere in the middle. Neither of us, I'm sure, are totally right. We can't know everything there is to know about God. Let's not argue about this anymore. That's how I would handle it. And that's how I had heard it handled before, and so I left it at that. And that's pretty much how I dealt with it throughout my time at Nyack. One thing that did happen during my time there was I did come to see the light in regard to Rob Bell. Okay, I saw in the philosophy department there were some who had been influenced by Rob Bell's influences, and the one head philosophy teacher there got up and said some very dangerous things regarding how we should think about the gospel. And in the midst of my time there, I ended up reading this book right here. This is called Why We're Not Emergent. If any of you are still wondering what to do with Rob Bell, and those like him who follow in his footsteps in many ways, I recommend this book very strongly. This, along with D.A. Carson's Becoming Conversant with the Emergent Church, really were, I think, some defining books that really dealt with the emergent church movement the way it needed to be. And today you probably don't even hear the term used very much anymore. It was a few years ago now. And that helped me out a lot when I was at Nyack. And so when I came out, I was debating some of these issues in my mind, and I had seen the way in which theology could be abused, and really I was kind of on a quest to figure out how to think again. So that's where I was. After that, when I graduated, I decided to go over to Bosnia with my dad, where I had lived for a year and a half back in '02 and '03. We went back in 2011, and I spent a couple months there helping my dad set up a publishing office. And that's where I discovered one of my favorite teachers, who he is one of my favorite teachers now. I discovered John Piper, and he introduced me to some of the more biblical arguments for Reformed theology. What happened to me there was I had begun questioning some things. I had begun searching for answers, and what happened in Bosnia was some of the missionaries I talked to over there, in effect, they discouraged me from thinking, and basically communicated the idea that if you use your mind too much rather than your heart, you're going to become arrogant and prideful, and you're not going to get to know God the way you're supposed to. There's this divide between our mind and our hearts, and we need to stick to the heart. And they would never totally say check your mind at the door, but in effect, that's almost what I needed to do in order to really get along with them. But then when I watched Piper's teaching, even before he got into the theological content, which we're going to talk about later, he started to talk about how he thought. And I almost laid in my bed crying because he described the way he thought, and it lined up so much with the way that I process reality that it totally turned my world around, and I had to rethink so many things. And I didn't totally convert to Reformed theology at that point, but I was encouraged to start thinking again in ways that I had been discouraged to in times before. And so by the time I had finished his teaching series on Reformed theology, I came back to America, and I wasn't quite there yet, but I started reading. And what he had done is he had pointed outside of his teaching to the theologian Jonathan Edwards. I mentioned him 2 videos ago, and so you can go ahead and take a look at that. I mentioned his work in The Freedom of the Will when I was talking about our sin nature. And it was that work, The Freedom of the Will, that I went and read, and that really opened my eyes to faulty thinking that I had had in the past about the nature of the will and the way that God commands us to use our will, and where our will and our free will stands in relationship to God. And that really, you might say, really was the last nail in the coffin to my old way of thinking in regard to the mind and the heart. And really, I felt like my mind and my heart were reconciled, in that I was able to think, and my thinking fueled my passion for God, and my passion for God encouraged me to go and think more, and to study more, and to know Him more through His Word and through those who had come before who had studied His Word. And so that's kind of where I arrived, and I became a Reformed Charismatic. I still hold to the gifts of the Spirit, even though many Reformed people don't, and that's why I line up so well with my denomination now. I'm part of the Acts 29 Church Planting Network, and so that's where I stand. And I kind of want to invite you on this journey with me. I don't necessarily want to cram my thoughts down your throat or make you think exactly the same way I do in all areas, but I want to encourage you not to shut your mind off when it comes to these things. Allow your mind to branch out a bit and believe that really your mind becomes a pathway to your heart. It's not in contradiction to your heart. It's not meant to be. God made you a whole person, and He wants you to think and feel. He wants you to know about Him and feel toward Him. He wants you to both know Him and love Him, because that's how you can truly give all of yourself to God, to love Him with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I just want to read a quick quote from you from John Piper that really helped me from his book, Think. I had read it some of the ways through this journey, and we'll finish up with this. He says, "Thinking is dangerous and indispensable. Without a profound work of grace in the heart, thinking puffs up. But with that grace, thinking opens the door of humble knowledge. And that knowledge is the fuel of the fire of love for God and man." So rather than putting yourself in a position where your mind is always in conflict with your heart and you need to stop thinking and just feel your way to God, God gave us a book, the Bible, to get to know Him. Obviously, He didn't want us to shut our minds off. And so as we approach these more difficult aspects, I want to remind you of the importance of theology, the importance of the heart, in the process. And I just want to invite you as we study these next things in the next videos. So thanks for watching. I'll post some links again in the description if you care to order my book. And I'll see you next time. So thanks for watching.
Bring us love. You